In the Soviet Union, there was a saying about Anastas Mikoyan, from Ilyich to Ilyich, without heart attack or stroke, from Lenin to Brezhnev. One man, 4 decades, every leader, every purge, every crisis, and a quiet retirement at 72. In a system that consumed almost everyone who reached its highest levels, that is not a small thing. That is the most interesting story nobody talks about, the seminary student. Anastas Ivanovich Mikoyan was born on November 25, 1895, in the village of Sanahin, in what was then Russian Armenia, now part of the Lori province of the Republic of Armenia. His father, Hovhannes, was a carpenter. His mother was a rug weaver. The family was not poor by Armenian village standards of the time, but they were not comfortable either. What they had was enough to send their son to school. Mikoyan received his education at the Nercesian School in Tiflis and then at the Gevorgian Seminary in Vagashapat, both institutions affiliated with the Armenian Apostolic Church, both designed to produce priests and clergymen for a community that had organized much of its institutional life around the church for over 15 centuries. He later remarked that studying religion had made him an atheist. This is a more common biographical trajectory than it might seem for the Bolshevik generation. Both Stalin and Dzerzhinsky had also trained for the priesthood before discovering revolutionary politics. The rigorous ideological education of a seminary, it turned out, was excellent preparation for the rigorous ideological demands of Bolshevism. The institution changed. The certainty required of its servants did not. Mikoyan joined the Bolshevik Party in 1915 at the age of 20 and immediately became active in the revolutionary movement in the Caucasus. He was not a theorist. He was an organizer, a man who could build networks, manage people, and execute plans under pressure. He participated in the revolutionary events of 1917 in Baku, the oil city on the Caspian that was, at the time, producing half the world's petroleum and was a genuine prize for whatever political force controlled it. In 1918, during the chaos of the Civil War, he was arrested by British troops that had intervened in support of the anti-Bolshevik forces in the region. He was released. He went back to work. His younger brother Artem would later go on to co-found the MiG Aircraft Design Bureau, one of those biographical footnotes that only the Soviet system could produce, where an Armenian carpenter's son who joined the Bolsheviks at 20s ended up with a fighter jet designer for a sibling. By 1923, Mikoyan's consistent support for Stalin in the succession struggle, following Lenin's incapacitation, earned him a place on the Central Committee. In 1926, he became People's Commissar for External and Internal Trade, a position that put him in charge of the entire apparatus of Soviet commerce, including the politically sensitive matter of foreign imports and exports. In 1935, he was elevated to full Politburo membership. He was 39 years old. He had been in the party for 20 years and had never, as far as the record shows, made a significant political mistake. The survivor. The years between 1936 and 1938 consumed the Soviet leadership with a thoroughness that has no real parallel in modern political history. Of the members of Lenin's original Politburo, almost all were arrested, tried, and executed, or died in other circumstances that the party preferred not to examine too closely. Of the full and candidate members of the Politburo who had served at any point between 1917 and 1940, the majority were dead by 1940. Of the delegates to the 17th Party Congress in 1934, the Congress that had celebrated Stalin's achievements with particular enthusiasm, more than half were subsequently arrested. The military leadership was decimated. The diplomatic corps was devastated. The security services consumed their own personnel in successive waves. Mikoyan survived. Precisely how he survived, what combination of political instinct, careful positioning, useful economic expertise, and sheer fortune kept him alive while colleagues with whom he had worked for decades were being taken away, is one of the genuine historical puzzles of the Stalinist period. What is documented is that he was present, and that he participated. In 1937, Stalin sent him to Armenia to oversee the purge of the local Communist Party. Leadership. More than 1,000 people were arrested during that operation. 7 of 9 members of the Armenian Politburo were removed from their positions. Mikoyan signed a list prepared by the Armenian NKVD of 300 names to be subject to repression. He later wrote in his memoirs that he had crossed out one name from that list, that of Danush Shaverdian, but that this intervention had been futile. Whether this story reflects exactly what happened, or whether it is the kind of detail a man inserts into his account of a terrible period to establish that he had at least tried to resist in some small way, is difficult to determine from the outside. What the documented record shows is that he was there, that the arrests proceeded, and that he returned to Moscow afterward. He also signed some of the Politburo's collective approvals for large-scale repression during the peak years of the terror. The historical debate about exactly what he knew, what he could have resisted, and what responsibility he bears for what was done is genuine and unresolved. What is not in dispute is that he remained in the Politburo throughout the entire period, that he was present for the decisions, and that he survived while almost everyone around him did not. Stalin's daughter Svetlana Alliluyeva, who observed the Politburo's senior figures from childhood, wrote that Mikoyan had a particular quality she found difficult to name precisely, a kind of careful, watchful intelligence that never quite committed itself to anything that could be used against him. He was, she suggested, always somehow slightly to the side of whatever was most dangerous. This description may be the most accurate portrait of what his survival actually consisted of, the commissar of American ideas. Among the less discussed but historically significant aspects of Mikoyan's career is that he was, by the standards of his generation and his system, genuinely open to learning from the outside world, including from the capitalist countries that Soviet ideology officially designated as enemies. In 1936, Mikoyan traveled to the United States on an official mission to study the American food industry. He visited factories, processing plants, distribution networks, and retail establishments. He returned to the Soviet Union with a set of ideas that he actually implemented. Soviet production of canned goods was modeled partly on American methods he had observed in 1936. The Soviet ice cream industry was restructured based on what he had seen in America, a connection that became genuinely famous in Russia, where Mikoyan's name is still sometimes associated with ice cream in a way that combines historical memory with a certain affectionate absurdity. He brought back ideas about refrigeration, food processing, and mass production that shaped Soviet consumer food culture for decades. This willingness to look at the world practically, to set aside ideology when practical knowledge was available, distinguished him from many of his colleagues and explained part of his long institutional value. He was useful in ways that pure ideological enforcers were not, because he could navigate both the internal politics of the Soviet system and the external reality of a world that did not run on Marxist principles. What the war showed. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Mikoyan was appointed to the State Defense Committee, the GKO, the seven-man body that effectively governed the Soviet Union throughout the war. It was chaired by Stalin and included Beria, Voroshilov, Malenkov, Molotov, and Voznesensky alongside Mikoyan. These seven men made the decisions that determined whether the Soviet Union survived the German invasion. And they made them under pressure, with incomplete information, in conditions of military catastrophe that the first weeks of Barbarossa produced on a scale that is almost impossible to overstate. Mikoyan's specific responsibility within the GKO was supply, the procurement and distribution of resources to the armed forces. This was not a glamorous assignment, but it was an absolutely essential one. The Red Army's ability to fight depended on its ability to be fed, equipped, and supplied with ammunition. The Lend-Lease program, the American and British shipment of materials to the Soviet Union, flowed through the coordination mechanisms that Mikoyan's commissariat managed. By the Soviet government's own accounting, United States delivered approximately 17.5 million tons of military equipment, vehicles, industrial supplies, and food to the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1945 through Lend-Lease. The administrative work of receiving, processing, and distributing that volume of material was, in significant part, Mikoyan's problem. He handled it competently and without the kind of political drama that surrounded some of his colleagues' wartime roles. While Zhukov was fighting battles and Beria was running security operations and Molotov was conducting diplomacy, Mikoyan was making sure the trains ran and the supply lines functioned. It was the kind of work that receives little historical attention, but without which everything else stops. The death of Stalin and the pivot. On March 5, 1953, Stalin died at Kuntsevo. Mikoyan had been at Stalin's side for 30 years. He had watched the man who had defined Soviet power since the mid-1920s lose his capacity to speak, lose his physical control, and finally stop breathing. According to Britannica, Mikoyan had apparently been coming close to losing Stalin's favor in the final period, the paranoid late Stalin years when almost anyone could become a target on almost any pretext. Stalin died before he could act on whatever suspicions he had developed. Mikoyan navigated the succession with the same quality of careful, watchful positioning that had kept him alive through the 1930s. He supported the arrest of Beria in June 1953. He aligned himself with Khrushchev as Khrushchev consolidated power through 1954 and 1955. He supported Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign, which was a remarkable pivot for a man who had signed purge lists and sat in the Politburo throughout the entire Stalin period. At the 20th Party Congress in February 1956, where Khrushchev delivered his famous secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes before a closed session of the party, Mikoyan spoke before Khrushchev and was the first senior Soviet figure to explicitly criticize the Stalin cult in a party forum. He did this as a man who had been one of Stalin's closest associates for 30 years. The personal and political complexity of that moment, what it meant for him to stand up and say, in effect, that the man he had served for 3 decades had done terrible things, is something his memoirs discuss only obliquely. He served as first deputy premier under Khrushchev, became Khrushchev's closest diplomatic deputy, and traveled to places and met figures that few Soviet officials of his generation approached. In 1959, he visited the United States and met with Eisenhower, the first senior Soviet leader to make such a visit in the post-war period. He traveled to Cuba in the early days of the revolution and met Fidel Castro, helping to establish the Soviet-Cuban relationship that would become one of the defining features of the Cold War. Havana, November 1962. The most extraordinary chapter of Mikoyan's diplomatic career came in the weeks after the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. The crisis itself, the 13 days in which Soviet missiles in Cuba and American naval forces in the Caribbean brought the world closer to nuclear war than it had ever been, was resolved on October 28th through a direct agreement between Kennedy and Khrushchev. The Soviets would remove their missiles. The Americans would pledge not to invade Cuba and would quietly remove their Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Fidel Castro was furious. He had not been consulted. He felt that Cuba had been used as a bargaining chip in a superpower negotiation that treated Cuban sovereignty as irrelevant. He was, by multiple accounts, enraged in a way that made the diplomatic aftermath potentially as dangerous as the crisis itself, because the Soviets had quietly planned to leave over 100 tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba, even after the main missiles were withdrawn. And Castro's reaction to the agreement raised the question of whether those weapons were safe in his hands. Khrushchev sent Mikoyan to Havana to manage the situation. Mikoyan arrived in Cuba on November 2, 1962, the day his wife of more than 40 years, Ashkan Lazarevna Tumanyan, died in Moscow. He received the news and stayed. He did not return for her funeral. He remained in Cuba and the United States for weeks, conducting the negotiations that resolved the tactical nuclear weapons question and rebuilt the Soviet-Cuban relationship from its moment of maximum strain. He met with Castro in Havana, met with Kennedy in Washington on November 29th, and met with Secretary of State Rusk the following day. The conversations in Washington, documented in State Department memoranda, covered Berlin, a Latin American nuclear-free zone, a nuclear test ban, and surprise attack protocols. His son Sergo, who served as his personal secretary during those weeks, later wrote that his father never mentioned his wife's death to anyone during the negotiations, and simply continued working. The decision to stay, the subordination of a profound personal loss to an institutional obligation that he had decided was more urgent, is the kind of detail that tells you something about the man that political biography usually cannot. What he never said. After Khrushchev was removed in October 1964, Mikoyan held the largely ceremonial position of chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, formerly the head of state of the USSR, until December 1965, when he retired at the age of 70. He lived quietly in Moscow for another 13 years, writing memoirs that were published in part during the Soviet period and more fully afterward. He died on October 21, 1978, at the age of 82. He had outlived Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, and the first years of the Brezhnev era. He had been a member of the Politburo, or its equivalent, for over 30 years. He had participated in or observed essentially every major decision of Soviet domestic and foreign policy from the mid-1920s to the mid-1960s. His memoirs, published in Russian as Tak Bilo, So It Was, are substantial and in places genuinely revealing. They contain details about Stalin's private behavior, about the atmosphere of the late Purge years, about the Cuban Missile Crisis, about Khrushchev's character, that no other surviving participant recorded in comparable depth. They are also, by the assessment of most historians who have worked with them, carefully selective. There are things Mikoyan knew that do not appear in those pages. There are moments he was present for that are described in ways that place him at the edge of the frame rather than at its center. There are decisions whose full internal history he could have provided and chose not to. This is not surprising. He had spent 60 years learning, with perfect precision, exactly what could be said and what could not. The memoirs are the work of a man who had internalized that lesson so completely that even in retirement, even with no institutional consequence remaining, the habit of careful omission was simply part of how he thought. There is a particular kind of historical frustration attached to figures like Mikoyan. He was there. He was present for almost everything that mattered in Soviet history across 4 decades. He was a close observer of Lenin in his final years, of Stalin across the full arc of his power, of Khrushchev's reforms and their limitations, of the Cuban Missile Crisis from its resolution through its difficult diplomatic aftermath. He had the intelligence to understand what he was seeing and the longevity to observe its consequences. What he left behind is valuable but incomplete, shaped by the same instincts that had kept him alive. The recognition that total honesty in the system he had served was not a quality that was rewarded or that survived. The man who had navigated from Lenin to Brezhnev without heart attack or stroke had done so partly by understanding, with great precision, the difference between what could be known and what could be said. From Ilyich to Ilyich, without heart attack or stroke, and with a very great deal left unsaid.